On a 47-acre site in Merton, the largest toy factory on Earth built precision diesel engines and the world's first plastic model kits. Frog taught a generation of British boys what internal combustion sounded like. The screaming buzz across the park, the sweet sting of ether and castor oil, the propeller that could take the skin off a cold finger. Then the parent company collapsed. An acquisition binge that swelled Lines Brothers to 41 companies worldwide. A generational handover from builders to administrators. Every mould stripped from the factory floor and bartered to the Soviet Union for plastic shipped back across the Iron Curtain. Today the site is a self-storage warehouse. No plaque marks the ground. This is the story of three founders with a laundry mangle who built something a generation never forgot, and the bankruptcy that sent it to Moscow. Not through one catastrophe. Through a long chain of reasonable decisions, each one moving the moulds a little further from the toolmakers who cut them. Chapter 1. 3 men and a laundry mangle. The story begins not with a factory, but with an obsession. Charles Mandeville Wilmot, known to everyone as Bill, and his younger brother John were schoolboys who'd caught aviation fever in the last months of the Great War. While other boys collected cigarette cards, the Wilmots produced handwritten magazines. The Aeroplane World dated December 17, 1918, 2 weeks before Christmas, 5 weeks after the armistice, and the Aeroplane Monthly, filled with sketches of fuselage construction and notes on thin aluminium sheet. By the late 1920s, they were accomplished amateur model builders, the sort of men who could spend an entire weekend in a shed carving a propeller from a block of beech. What they lacked was the means to turn a hobby into a business. The third founder was a craftsman whose ingenuity bordered on the eccentric. Joseph Naime Mansour. Joe, to everyone who knew him, had already earned recognition for his contribution to the 1:12 scale Queen Mary's Doll's House, that extraordinary miniature mansion still displayed at Windsor Castle. But his breakthrough came from somewhere rather more domestic. Mansour discovered that if you compressed sheets of newspaper and glue through a laundry mangle, his family's own mangle, repurposed without apology, the resulting material could be formed into aircraft fuselages that were astonishingly light, yet structurally sound. Moulded papier-mâché. It sounds like a children's craft project. It was, in fact, a genuine engineering innovation. In 1931, Mansour placed a small advertisement in Flight magazine seeking partners to manufacture model aeroplanes. Bill and John Wilmot answered, and in that moment, an immigrant craftsman with a laundry mangle and 2 aviation-obsessed brothers responding to a classified ad. A business was born that would define boyhood for an entire generation. Together, the 3 men formed 2 companies in 1931. The first, Wilmot, Mansour and Company, Limited, held their patents. The second, International Model Aircraft Limited, IMA, was the production company. That separation of intellectual property from commercial operations was a shrewd move. It would later allow the founders to develop the GTEx rocket motor system entirely independently of whatever happened to IMA. But in 1931, patent protection wasn't enough. 3 enthusiasts with a clever idea needed capital, factory space, and a distribution network that could reach beyond South London. They found all 3 in a single family. Walter Lines, William Joseph Lines, and Arthur Edwin Lines were the sons of Joseph Lines, whose family had been making toys since the 1850s. The 3 brothers had founded Lines Brothers Limited on May 1st, 1919, borrowing £28,000 from Lloyd's Bank to acquire factory premises on the Old Kent Road. Walter, born in 1882, was the driving force, managing director, chief designer, and the kind of Victorian Edwardian industrialist who believed that if you needed a component, you should make it yourself. He'd attended evening classes in design, carpentry and cabinet making, risen to captain in the Royal Horse Artillery during the war, mentioned in dispatches, and was credited, rather improbably, with inventing the scooter at age 15. William handled sales. Arthur ran the factory floor. By 1924, the Lines brothers had moved to a purpose-built 47-acre site on Morden Road in Merton, southwest London, adopting the brand name Triang. 3 lines make a triangle. It was already one of the largest toy factories in Europe, and it would grow into the largest in the world. All 5 men, the 2 Wilmots, Mansour, and the 3 Lines brothers, became directors of IMA. The arrangement gave Frog considerable independence, its own premises within the factory complex, access to Lines brothers' worldwide distribution network, and crucially, funding. Arthur Lines became chairman. By 1933, Lines brothers had acquired a considerable interest in IMA, making it effectively a subsidiary. But the Wilmots and Mansour kept their patents in the separate company. That decision would prove prescient. The Frog name itself was Joe Mansour's creation. Model aeroplane competitions in Britain featured a category called Rise Off the Ground. Rubber-powered models launched from a standing start. Mansour coined the acronym from first to rise off ground, expressing the advantage his papier-mâché models had over heavier stick-and-silk machines. Later, the meaning shifted to the catchier flies right off the ground. The letters W and M, for Wilmot and Mansour, were worked into the logo. The trademark was registered in 1932, and a cheerful winged frog became the company mascot. 5 men, 2 companies, a laundry mangle, and a name that would outlive every one of them. Chapter 2. 800 interceptors a day. The first Frog product launched in November 1932 and announced immediately that something new had arrived in British toy making. The Frog Interceptor Fighter Mark IV was a semi-scale rubber band-powered flying model with a duralumin fuselage and paper wings, bearing a family resemblance to the Supermarine Schneider trophy racers that had captivated the nation. But what set it apart wasn't beauty. It was ambition. The rubber motor drove the propeller through a miniature Swiss-made gearbox with a 3.4:1 ratio, allowing a smaller, more realistic propeller spinning at 2,700 revolutions per minute. A high-speed geared winder was built into the model's own box. The Interceptor could travel 300 feet at a height of 70 feet, a scale speed equivalent to 240 miles per hour. And they made a lot of them. By November 1932, the Merton works was turning out over 800 interceptors a day. By 1933, the rate had climbed to 1,000. Initially priced at 10 shillings and sixpence, the price came down successively to 7 and 6, and then 5 shillings as production efficiencies improved. Walter Lines' philosophy of making things cheaper by making more of them, applied with characteristic aggression. Versions appeared in Belgian, Italian, Dutch, French, Argentine and American military colours. The Interceptor remained in continuous production until 1940. 8 years. For a model aircraft. The timing was perfect. Charles Lindbergh's solo transatlantic flight in 1927 had created an enormous wave of air-mindedness across Britain. Model aeroplane clubs flourished. Flight competitions drew crowds. A mass-produced, affordable flying model arriving into that fever was less a product launch than a cultural event. Through the mid-1930s, IMA expanded rapidly. A scale DH-80A Puss Moth in 1934, capitalising on the celebrity of Amy Johnson and Jim Mollison. An ambitious 3-motor Hawker Hart in 1935. A shift to lighter balsa wood construction and die-cut kit sets in 1936. Each product building on the last, each one reaching a slightly wider audience. But the most consequential innovation came from solving a problem so prosaic it seems absurd in hindsight. Wooden propellers kept breaking along the grain on landing. IMA began moulding propellers from cellulose acetate, an early thermoplastic, and since Lines brothers, in Walter Lines' own words, famously loathed buying in components from outside, they acquired injection moulding capability in-house. Having mastered the technology for propellers, someone, almost certainly Mansour, realised it could be used for entire aircraft models. In late 1936, IMA launched the Frog Penguin range, the world's first plastic model construction kits. Moulded in cellulose acetate at 1:72 scale, 1 inch to 6 feet, a ratio chosen for its elegance in imperial measurement. The penguins were non-flying display models, named for the flightless bird to distinguish them from Frog's flying range. The first kit was a Gloucester Gladiator, dated November 30th, 1936, with advertising appearing in Meccano magazine by January 1937. By February 1940, approximately 28 penguin variants were on the market. They predated Airfix's first injection moulded kit by some 17 years. The world's first plastic model kits came not from some vast American corporation, but from a South London factory that had started with a laundry mangle and a classified ad. Chapter 3. Rocket Gliders and the Novelist in the Restricted Zone. When war came, toy production ceased. Lines Brothers converted the Merton factory entirely to military output, and the workforce swelled to approximately 7,000 people. The numbers tell the story. Over 1 million Stenmark 3 submachine guns, 14 million magazines for Hurricane and Spitfire fighters, shell cases, landmine cases, and special infrared night vision apparatus. Walter Lines personally redesigned the Sten gun, producing the lighter Mark IV variant that reduced material requirements, a toy maker re-engineering a weapon for the British Army. IMA's contribution was more exotic. Joe Mansour oversaw production of aircraft recognition models, those matte black silhouettes used to train servicemen to identify aircraft in flight. The Frog Penguin moulds were repurposed for war. Bakelite, mahogany, buckram, nylon. The same tooling that had produced Gloucester Gladiators for boys' bedrooms now produced recognition aids for anti-aircraft batteries. Each model carried Store's reference numbers and the small winged frog emblem. Even in wartime, the mascot flew. But the most remarkable project brought someone unexpected into the Merton factory. Neville Shute Norway, the aeronautical engineer who, under the pen name Neville Shute, would write A Town Like Alice and On the Beach, led the department of the development of miscellaneous weapons. The DMWD commandeered IMA's expertise for several extraordinary ventures. A. Burt Judge, the 1936 Wakefield Trophy winner whom IMA had recruited in 1937, designed an Admiralty rocket glider target under Shute's direction. A 43-inch, 6.5-pound moulded paper aircraft powered by a 2-pound thrust rocket, launched from a catapult by WRNS ratings, reaching 80 to 90 miles per hour and 250 feet. Sets of 100 gliders with 1,000 rocket charges were shipped to merchant vessels for anti-aircraft gunnery training. An estimated 5 to 10,000 were produced. Then came Project Swallow, a full-size unmanned aircraft, 19-foot wingspan, 12 feet long, 820 pounds. Designed by IMA in consultation with RAE Farnborough and consulting aerodynamicist Stanley Hansel. Built in a restricted area of the Triang factory, powered by 20 50-pound thrust rockets for launch, plus 4 sustainer rockets and a smoke generator, it first flew on December 19, 1942. Its purpose was laying smoke screens at distance from ships following the Dieppe disaster. Only about 20 were built before cancellation in July 1944, but the data collected helped produce some of Britain's earliest guided missiles. A model aircraft company, founded by a man with a laundry mangle, designing unmanned rocket-powered aircraft inside a toy factory. IMA also built 26-foot towed target gliders for RAF and Admiralty gunnery training, and produced scale models of the Normandy beaches for D-Day planning. The Merton factory had gone from producing flying toys to contributing, in its own small way, to the liberation of Europe. In 1943, John Wilmot died in a car accident. The following year, Bill Wilmot and Joe Mansour severed their relationship with IMA, refocusing on what would become the GTEx rocket motor through Wilmot, Mansour and Company. The patent company they'd kept separate from the beginning. That decision, made 13 years earlier, had paid for itself. The founders had departed. Frog's future now rested entirely with Lines Brothers. Chapter 4. The Smell of Ether and Castor Oil. The post-war period transformed Frog from a maker of rubber-powered models and plastic kits into something more ambitious, a manufacturer of miniature internal combustion engines that remain, 7 decades later, objects of genuine engineering admiration. The engine program began in 1946 with the Frog 175, a 1.75 cubic centimeters spark ignition motor based on a prototype developed by George Court. Bert Judge, the same man who designed rocket gliders for Neville Shute, was put in charge of post-war engine manufacturing. Under his leadership, IMA produced its first diesel, the Frog 100, a 0.99 cubic centimeter motor, in late 1946 or early 1947. These early engines, known to collectors as the Bicycle Spoke series for their distinctive crankshaft design, were highly individualistic. Each one felt handmade. They gave post-war modelers their first practical introduction to power flying and established Frog as a serious engine manufacturer. Through the late 1940s and 1950s, the range expanded with a purposefulness that said something about what the Merton Works could do when it turned its mind to precision engineering. The Frog 500 glow-plug engine, 4.92 cubic centimeters, introduced in late 1949, became what engine historian Adrian Duncan called perhaps the best general-purpose British glow motor of the 1950s. Robust, dependable, and popular for sport and stunt flying over a 14-year production run. C.R. Bob. Bright ran the production side of the 500 line in the late 1940s and early 1950s, overseeing the manufacture of an engine that became the backbone of British club flying. The Frog 150 diesel, launched in 1951, was the commercial mainstay. At least 17,233 units produced over approximately 4 years. The tiny Frog 50, announced in February 1952, was the smallest Frog ever made. Half a cubic centimetre of displacement, a mechanical heartbeat you could hold between finger and thumb. The mid-1950s brought the Frog 149 Vibromatic, a unique diaphragm induction diesel that engine historians describe as a genuine one-of-a-kind that worked surprisingly well. When Bert Judge departed in the early 1950s, the program passed to George Fletcher, who came from a model engineering family and had previously worked at Davies Charlton and Ulbon Engineering. Fletcher was assisted by Gordon Cornell, who developed the refined Frog 150R in 1958 and later became chief designer at ED. Fletcher's masterwork arrived in January 1959, the Frog 349. At 3.43 cubic centimetres, it was the largest and most technically sophisticated diesel Frog ever produced. Cross-flow loop scavenging with a side exhaust stack, drum valve induction. The legendary engine tester Peter Chin called it one of the most technically interesting diesels to appear from a British manufacturer for a long time. Available in both ball-bearing and plain-bearing versions, it was the most powerful British 3.5 cubic centimetres diesel then on the market, with what Chin called the best crankcase casting yet seen on a British engine. At least 13,225 were manufactured by IMA. Collectors say it appears to run forever if properly maintained. But the numbers and the specifications don't tell you what it was like. To understand what Frog's engines meant, you have to understand what happened in the parks. Control line flying was the drone racing of its era, except it demanded real mechanical skill, real danger, and produced an unforgettable sensory assault. The aircraft was tethered to the pilot by 2 steel control lines, typically 20 to 70 feet long, flying in circles while the pilot controlled the elevator through a handle. The engine, a Frog 150. For smaller models, a 349 or 500 for serious stunt work, ran on diesel fuel, roughly 1/3 each of kerosene, ether and castor oil, with a splash of amyl nitrate as an ignition improver. Starting a diesel engine was a ritual. You primed the cylinder, set the compression screw, opened the needle valve, and flicked the propeller with your finger, wearing a rubber hose finger shield if you were wise, because a large diesel like the 349 could clobber your flicking finger hard and go into hydraulic lock if flooded. When the engine caught, the effect was immediate and dramatic. A screaming, buzzing roar at 8 to 13,000 revolutions per minute, the characteristic high-pitched whine carrying across the entire field. The exhaust trailed behind the model as it whirled, a mist of burned castor oil and ether that settled on everything, leaving a black, oily residue on hands, clothes, and every blade of grass within range. The smell was, and remains, the single most powerful trigger of nostalgia for an entire generation. The fuels of the 1950s and 1960s contained 20 to 28% castor oil, far more than modern formulations, producing a heady, sweet, medicinal tang that fused ether's sharp chemical bite with castor oil's warm, thick aroma. It was the same smell that drifted from racing circuits where Castrol R was used, the same perfume that, decades later, could still stop a grown man in his tracks if he caught a trace of it on the wind. One enthusiast's description cuts to the heart of it. The smell of diesel fuel is addictive. It's not anywhere like automotive diesel fumes. It's a perfume. Saturday morning, pocket money clutched in hand. Racing to the local model shop, perhaps Beck models in Tooting Beck, or a newsagent that kept a rack of kits behind the counter. The silver-painted plastic of jet fighters gleaming through cellophane windows on the box. The rush home to tear it open, the distinctive solvent smell of polystyrene cement, glue and paint all over your fingers, the rush to finish, the finished article complete with huge gaps and fingerprints on the transparencies, and blobs of wet paint. As one collector remembers, with the wince of fond recognition. But that was only half the story. The other half happened outdoors, in the parks and playing fields, and it was far more visceral. It involved fire, noise, oil, and the ever-present risk of a propeller blade finding your knuckle. These weren't toys. They were miniature machines, and they taught a generation of British boys how internal combustion actually worked. Chapter 5. Inside the largest toy factory on Earth. The Merton Works at its peak was a place of almost absurd ambition. A 750,000 square foot factory spread across 47 acres on Morden Road, confirmed as the largest toy factory in the world. It had its own half-mile of railway sidings connecting to the main line along the northern boundary. A football field sat in the centre of the complex, doubling as IMA's private, confidential model aircraft test aerodrome. The factory had been designed by Walter Lines himself, and it expressed his philosophy of total vertical integration taken to its logical extreme. A 1950 article in Games and Toys magazine, marking Lines Brothers' Silver Jubilee, captured the scale. One of the largest tool rooms in the metropolis, containing more than 200 expert toolmakers who made tools and dies for over 500 power presses up to 300 tons pressure, and 1,000 hand presses, injection moulding, and other machinery. The paint laboratory produced 2,000 gallons of paint per week. A 1¼ acre sawmill felled, converted, kiln-dried, and turned timber. The factory made its own packing cases and crates. Nothing was wasted. Sawdust and wood cuttings were exhausted to gas producers, the gas-heated boilers whose steam ran high-speed engines driving air compressors. Exhaust steam heated plating tanks, conveyor drying ovens, premises, and hot water. Lines Bros bought a paint company because they used paint. They bought a paper company because they used paper. They bought forestry operations to grow their own trees. Over 4,000 employees worked at Merton in peacetime, producing not only frog models, but fairy cycles, Minic vehicles, pedigree dolls, and the full range of Triang toys. For Frog specifically, the most vivid surviving testimony comes from Eric Walpole, who joined in 1953 through a personal connection, a friend who serviced Lines Brothers directors' cars. Offered a position by works manager Charlie Green, Walpole found himself in a small experimental department under chief designer Mr. Buffery, universally known as Buff, working alongside designer Ron Pusey. The managing director was Arthur Cathcart. Walpole designed kits in the Junior Fighter series, the Spitfire, Mustang and Wyvern, and the Exeter ship kit. His account of the design process reveals the craftsmanship behind every Frog kit. Patterns carved from yellow pine or lime wood were cast into hard stone moulds, then cut at reduced size into steel mould blocks by toolmakers using pantograph machines. The same 200 toolmakers whose expertise was the pride of the Merton works. The department was small but full of characters. Ron Aarons, a former RAF rear gunner, designed the Tempest kit and a radio-controlled air-sea rescue launch. Bill Knox, whose family were undertakers, designed the Chipmunk, an occupation and a product that seemed to belong to entirely different worlds. Les Green, a drummer in a band, worked alongside them. Cyril Steen, a former Airfix employee, crossed South London to design the iconic motorised E-Type Jaguar and Cortina estate car kits for Frog. And when the time came to produce a model of the R100 airship, kit F128, 1/500th scale, 1965, Sir Barnes Wallis himself consulted on the design. That mould is reportedly still in use in Russia today, a tribute to the Merton toolmaker's craft that has outlived the company, the Cold War, and the country that bought it. George Fletcher, the engine designer, would drive the colourful Frog van to shows and competitions with staff to demonstrate control line models, the Radius and the Vandiver, tested in a local playing field. They weren't paid overtime for the weekend work. The company paid for their dinner and a bottle of wine on the way home. It was that kind of place. Not luxurious, not sentimental, but decent. A factory where a man on the packing line, spotting a young boy peering through the window, could hand him a free E-Type Jaguar kit without anyone making a fuss about it. Frog's commercial reach by the late 1950s extended through Lines Brothers' network of 40 companies worldwide and 21 factories. Export markets spanned the globe. In France, kits were sold under the Triang brand, because selling a product called Frog to French customers presented obvious cultural difficulties. In North America, they were repackaged as Airlines, a clever allusion to Lines Brothers. Remarkably, the two great British rivals were near neighbours, the Frog factory in Merton, SW19, and the Airfix factory in Wandsworth, SW18, stood less than 4 miles apart. Two South London enterprises, separated by a few bus stops, competing for the same pocket money. Frog's strategy differed fundamentally from Airfix's. Where Airfix pursued mass-market appeal with well-known aircraft types and superior box art, commanding 75% of the UK model kit market by the mid-1970s, Frog deliberately targeted lesser-known and obscure subjects that no other manufacturer offered. The Avro Shackleton, the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, the Westland Wyvern, the Dornier DO 335, the Heinkel HE 219, the Fairey Barracuda, the Bristol 138, aircraft available from nobody else, making Frog kits essential for serious enthusiasts and collectors while limiting mass market penetration. In quality terms, the kits were remarkably similar to Airfix in detail and moulding, with Frog's fine recessed panel lines actually more realistic than Airfix's raised rivets. But Airfix had better box art and included paint reference keys that Frog lacked. It was a trade-off that served the connoisseur at the expense of the casual buyer. And for a time, with Lines Brothers' distribution muscle behind it, the trade-off worked. Chapter 6. The Summit Before the Cliff. Frog's commercial and creative peak fell in the years 1959 to 1963. The polystyrene plastic kit range, relaunched in 1955 after the cellulose acetate penguins were dropped in 1949, had hit its stride. The Spitfire Mark II, issued in 1959 as Kit 394P, and the Focke-Wulf 190 became the two best-selling Frog kits in history, with combined total sales exceeding 700,000 units. The Boeing 707, Kit F140, produced between 1958 and 1970, reached a total of 65,000 units from Merton alone. By 1963, all Frog aircraft kits were standardized to 1:72 scale, rationalizing the range. Between 1963 and 1976, 84 kits were produced to that single scale. The engine range was simultaneously at its finest. The Frog 349 represented the pinnacle of British miniature diesel engineering and the supporting cast. The 80 diesel, with its innovative O-ring contrapiston, rated for over 100 operating hours. The Viper and Venom in 1.5 cubic centimetres. Diesel and glow plug variants. Gave serious modelers a range that covered every application from Sunday afternoon sport, flying to competitive stunt work. These were not toys dressed up as engineering. They were engineering that happened to be miniature. Lines Bros claimed to be the largest toy manufacturer in the world. The Merton Works was a showpiece of British manufacturing. In 1958, Walter Lines published a memoir, Looking Backwards and Looking Forwards, a title that inadvertently captured the moment's fatal optimism. Looking backwards at what he'd built, looking forwards at a future he assumed would be more of the same. But even at the summit, there were signs. In 1962, IMA ceased engine manufacture entirely. The tooling was transferred in 1964 to Davies Charlton Limited on the Isle of Man, who continued production under contract. An era of precision miniature engineering at Merton had ended. Not because the engines weren't good, but because the economics of manufacturing them in South London no longer added up. The Frog Viper and Venom, outstanding 1.5 cubic centimetre designs, were never continued when production moved away from Merton. George Fletcher's workshop fell quiet. The engineers moved on or were reassigned. The tools were crated and shipped to the Isle of Man. It was, if you knew where to look, the first retreat. The first sign that Lines Brothers' sprawling empire was straining under its own weight. The first indication that the 47-acre factory, the 4,000 workers, the worldwide distribution network, all of it, rested on financial foundations that were not as solid as the Merton toolmaker's steel. In that same year, 1962, Walter Lines retired as chairman, becoming life president. Both Arthur Lines and William Lines, two of the three founding brothers, died. The generation that had built the empire from a £28,000 bank loan was gone. Their sons took the helm. Chapter 7. The Acquisition Machine. The Lines brothers had built their empire by making things. Their sons would attempt to grow it by buying things. The difference would prove fatal. The acquisition program began modestly enough. In 1946, Lines Brothers bought Joy Toys Limited in New Zealand, a sensible move into a Commonwealth market where Triang products already sold well. In 1951, they acquired Rovex Plastics Limited of Richmond, which became Rovex Scale Models, and produced the hugely successful Triang Railways system, largely the work of Richard Lines, Arthur's son, and one of the few second-generation achievements that genuinely expanded the empire's capabilities. They purchased 50% of Cyclops in Australia in 1951, the remainder in 1955. In 1958, they bought Mini Models Limited of Havant, which had introduced the Scalextric slot car racing system the previous year. That was an inspired acquisition. Scalextric became an enormous commercial success with Lines Bros' distribution muscle behind it. So far, so reasonable. Each purchase brought something specific: a brand, a technology, a market. But the logic of acquisition is seductive. Each successful purchase encourages the next. And the next one doesn't always make the same kind of sense. On February 14th, 1964, Valentine's Day as it happened, Lines Brothers acquired Meccano Limited, the Liverpool company that owned three of the most iconic names in British toys: Meccano construction sets, Hornby trains, and Dinky toys. Meccano had been in financial difficulty since the early 1960s, conservative and slow to innovate, its management clinging to products and methods that the market had begun to move past. The acquisition price was reportedly around £781,000 for the full share capital. On paper, it looked like a rescue. A strong company absorbing a weak one, saving beloved brands from extinction. In practice, it produced what one historian called corporate indigestion. Lines Bros was absorbing a failing company with its own sprawling Liverpool factory, its own ageing workforce, its own legacy costs, at precisely the moment when competitive pressures from American and Japanese imports were intensifying. Tamiya, Hasegawa, and Fujimi were producing model kits of exceptional quality at prices British manufacturers couldn't match. And further down the value chain, Hong Kong's toy factories, numbering over 1,100 by 1970, employing 40,000 workers, were undercutting British prices on everything from plastic soldiers to die-cast vehicles. By 1965, the combined model railway range was marketed as Triang Hornby. The merger looked seamless from the outside. Inside, it was anything but. Two corporate cultures, two sets of tooling, two workforces in two cities with different traditions, different unions, and different expectations. The savings that were supposed to justify the acquisition proved elusive. The costs proved stubborn. By 1966, Lines Brothers owned 41 companies worldwide. The empire spanned Britain, Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and France. Rovex scale models, pedigree soft toys, Minic, spot-on die-cast vehicles, Scale Extric, Meccano, Hornby, Dinky Toys, Hamleys of Regent Street. By any measure, it was colossal. By any honest financial assessment, it was dangerously overextended. The overseas operations, acquired at such pace and cost, began hemorrhaging money. Sterling depreciation worsened the burden of foreign currency debts. A later Court of Appeal case in Lines Brothers Limited, 1982, revealed the company owed 18.5 million Swiss francs to a single creditor bank, a debt that ballooned in sterling terms every time the pound weakened. Television was transforming how children played and what they wanted. The patient, mechanical pleasures of building a model aircraft or running a diesel engine in the park were losing ground to a screen that asked nothing of you except that you sat in front of it. And the men running the empire were not the men who had built it. Kenneth D. Brown, the economic historian at Queen's University Belfast, who studied the collapse in depth, titled his analysis with brutal precision, "Family Failure, Lines Brothers Limited, Deceased, 1971. W. Moray Lines, Walter's son, had become chairman. W. Graham Lines became joint managing director." Brown's academic assessment was damning. The second generation lacked the entrepreneurial drive of the founders. The nature of family business contributed to the collapse, with the passing of generations and loss of drive and tenacity. Walter Lines had designed his own factory, redesigned the Sten gun, and built a vertically integrated manufacturing empire from a £28,000 bank loan. His successors inherited that empire and managed it by acquisition, buying companies instead of building capabilities, expanding the map instead of deepening the foundations. The distinction matters. It is the difference between an industrialist and an administrator. And Lines Brothers, by the mid-1960s, was being run by administrators presiding over an industrialist's creation. In 1965, IMA, Frog's corporate vehicle since 1931, was merged into Rovex Scale Models Limited. It lost its independent identity. The founders' careful separation of IMA from Lines Brothers, the structure that had given Frog its own premises, its own culture, its own sense of purpose within the larger empire, was dissolved in a corporate reorganisation. Frog's fate was now inextricably bound to whatever happened to the parent. If the parent thrived, Frog would thrive. If the parent fell, Frog would fall with it. The parent was not going to thrive. Chapter 8. 5 years of reasonable decisions. The financial year ending. 1970 delivered the number that confirmed what insiders already knew. Lines Bros. posted a record loss of £4.5 million. Accumulated debts exceeded an estimated £17.5 million, approximately $42 million at the contemporary exchange rate. For a toy company, even the largest toy company in the world, these were figures from which recovery required either a miracle or a rescuer. A corporate reorganisation in June 1970 created Triang Pedigree Limited, incorporating the Merton, Merthyr Tydfil and Birmingham factories into a single operating entity. It was a deck chair rearrangement. The debts didn't care what the company was called. The overseas subsidiaries didn't stop bleeding because the letterhead changed. The Hong Kong factories didn't raise their prices out of respect for a corporate restructure. The board placed its hopes on Gallagher. Gallagher was a major tobacco company, founded in Derry, with a Belfast factory employing 3,000 workers. Like many tobacco firms in the early 1970s, it was diversifying into consumer goods, seeking new revenue streams as the long-term outlook for cigarette sales darkened. Lyons Bros's management was confident the deal would close. Gallagher offered £5 million for the company. Due diligence began. The mathematics were stark, even before the accountants opened the books. £5 million against accumulated debts of £17.5 million was hopelessly inadequate as a starting position. But the real problem lay in what the accountants found when they looked at the overseas operations. Subsidiary after subsidiary posting losses. Each one a drain on cash that no amount of rationalisation could quickly stanch. The Australian operations, the New Zealand operations, the South African operations. Companies acquired during 2 decades of expansion, each one sounding impressive on a board presentation. 41 companies worldwide. And each one, when examined individually, requiring investment that the parent couldn't provide and generating returns that didn't justify the investment it had already received. In August 1971, Gallagher withdrew the offer. The reasons were never publicly detailed. They didn't need to be. When this offer was withdrawn, no option was left to the company, but liquidation. That sentence, from the Merton Working Heritage record, carries the compressed weight of an empire's final hours. There was no second rescuer. There was no alternative plan. The board had bet everything on Gallagher, and Gallagher had walked away. In the autumn of 1971, Lyons Brothers called in the official receiver. The precise date is not recorded in publicly available sources, but it fell in September or October, weeks after Gallagher's withdrawal. The world's largest toy company was dead. It had taken the Lyons brothers 47 years to build. It had taken their sons less than 10 to lose. Walter Lyons, now 89, held the ceremonial title of Life President. He watched the empire he had built over half a century dismembered by administrators and accountants. He died on November 23, 1972, just over a year after the collapse. Whether the two events were connected is a question the historical record doesn't answer. But it doesn't need to. The breakup scattered the brands like shrapnel across the British toy industry. Rovex Triang, including Hornby Railways, Scalextric and Pedigree Dolls, was acquired by Dunby Combex Marks, a plastics and toys conglomerate formed from the merger of 3 smaller firms. DCM had engineered what the trade press called a £1 million toymaker's coup in 1967 by absorbing Marx's UK operations. They did not acquire the Triang brand name itself. That went to Barclay Securities for £3.6 million plus £1.678 million for the freeholds. So, DCM was forced to rebrand as Hornby Railways from January 1972. Meccano and Dinky Toys, the brands Lyons Brothers had bought from Liverpool just 7 years earlier, went to Airfix for £2.74 million. The Cyclops Triang operations in Australia and New Zealand, 10 companies in total, went to Tube Investments for £2.25 million. The adult cycle business went to Raleigh for £800,000. G&R Wren bought itself free. Walter Lyons' daughter Peggy took the wooden toy business into a new company, Goodwood Playthings. The teddy bear range became Canterbury Bears. In Belfast, production manager Jim Mulholland established Mulholland and Bailey to continue soft toy manufacturing. Each transaction represented someone's working life. Each company name on the liquidator's ledger corresponded to a factory floor, a works canteen, a car park that filled every morning and emptied every evening. The administrators measured the breakup in pounds and pence. The people who'd spent their careers inside those walls measured it differently. Frog production continued under DCM's Rovex models and hobbies division, but it was marginalised, one small line inside a conglomerate that had bigger problems to worry about. The early 1970s brought economic recession, surging oil prices that drove up the cost of plastic raw materials, and a market in which scale model kits were barely profitable, even for the market leader. IMA had ceased to exist as a corporate entity in 1972. The name was gone, the independence was gone, the founders were long gone. What remained was tooling, moulds, and a brand name, assets that could be valued, priced, and sold. And that is exactly what happened. Chapter 9. The Road to Moscow. By 1974, senior managers at DCM had taken the decision that would define Frog's afterlife. They would sell the manufacturing tools and kill the trademark. Not because Frog had failed, the kits still sold, the moulds still cut clean plastic, but because its assets could be liquidated to pay off debts elsewhere in the DCM empire. Frog was to be sacrificed not for its own sins, but for the sins of its corporate parents. First Lines Brothers, then DCM. Two successive owners, neither of whom had created the thing they were now destroying. The buyer was Novo Export, the Soviet Union's official foreign trade organization for toys and consumer goods. The negotiations began in 1974 and concluded with a contract signed in August 1975. The terms of the sale were extraordinary. The Soviets did not pay in hard currency. Instead, the deal was structured as a barter arrangement. Frog's moulds would be shipped to the USSR. Soviet factories would produce plastic sprue sets from them. The sprue sets would be shipped back to Britain, where an intermediary company, Novo Toys Limited, formally established in late 1976 and managed by Rovex Models and Hobbies, would package them with British printed boxes, instructions, and decals for Western sale. The Novo trademark was officially registered on January 18, 1977. Moulds designed in Merton, cut by 200 of the finest toolmakers in London, shipped across the Iron Curtain, used to produce plastic mouldings in Soviet factories, shipped back to Britain, packaged with English instructions, sold to British modelers. It was by any measure one of the most poignant transactions in British manufacturing history, a company's own creation returning to it as a foreign import, wearing a different name. There was an ideological wrinkle that would have been darkly comic if it weren't so telling. Novo Export declined to produce models of Axis Powers aircraft. German, Italian and Japanese subjects were politically unacceptable in the Soviet Union 3 decades after the war's end. Those moulds, Dorniers, Heinkels, Focke-Wulfs, the aircraft that Frog had specialised in because nobody else offered them, were acquired by Revell around 1977. Moulds for many jet aircraft went to Hasegawa in Japan, which had an existing cross-licensing arrangement with Frog dating from 1968. 2 moulds, a Dennis ambulance and a Firefly dinghy, stayed with Hornby Hobbies in Britain. The rest went east. The physical dispersal within the Soviet Union followed characteristically Soviet logic. Rather than concentrating production in a single efficient facility, the moulds were distributed across at least 20 factories spanning multiple republics, every republic receiving its share, regardless of manufacturing expertise. The Donetsk toy factory in Ukraine, described as the largest toy factory in the former USSR, received a significant allocation and began production in 1977. The Krugozor, Ogonyok, and Progress plants in Moscow. The Mir production enterprise in Minsk, Belarus. The Tashigrushka factory in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. Smaller runs came from factories in Baku, Sukhumi, Kursk, Yaroslavl, Saratov, Odessa, Uzhgorod, Tbilisi, Naro-Fominsk, and Bishkek. A geographical spread that reads like a Soviet atlas. For the Western market, Novo kits appeared in distinctive blue boxes with new artwork, first surfacing at the April 1977 Birmingham Toy Fair. For Soviet domestic consumption, the packaging was crude, low-quality card with illustrations that bore little relation to the actual model inside. No decals, only rough-coloured markings on instruction sheets. Despite this, the kits became hugely popular in the Soviet Union. British moulds, designed in Merton and tooled by Lines Brothers' expert craftsmen, were putting plastic aircraft into the hands of Soviet children from Donetsk to Tashkent. During 1974 to 1976, the Soviets had proposed that Rovex produce new moulds for Soviet aircraft subjects, 4 per year, to make the range more attractive for the domestic market. A list was drawn up, numbers assigned, basic drawings provided. In the end, only 4 were started: a MiG-3, a Lag-3, a Yak-3, and an Anatra DS Anasal. The Anatra DS mould was completed in November 1977, making it the last kit ever to emerge from the Rovex design office. About 500 mouldings were run off as a private enterprise. These 4 moulds later passed to Red Star Model Kits Limited, founded in 1983 by Jim Chapman at 16 Whitecroft Road, Beckenham, Kent. By March 1987, Red Star had produced 12,500 MiG-3s, 11,500 Lag-3s, 9,500 Anatras, and 8,500 Yak-3s. The last embers of Frog's design capability, burning quietly in a terraced house in Beckenham. The last Frog-branded kits were produced in 1976. Some were still being manufactured under the Frog name, even as the first batch of moulds was being loaded for shipment to the Soviet Union. By the time Novo Toys Limited was liquidated in 1980, when DCM itself went bankrupt in February of that year, the British side had purchased approximately 4 million sprue sets from Soviet factories. DCM's collapse was the second bankruptcy to destroy Frog. Lines Brothers had killed it the first time. DCM finished the job, and the pattern repeated itself with grim precision across the entire British toy industry. Airfix, which had briefly become Britain's foremost toy company by picking up Meccano and Dinky toys from the Lines Brothers wreckage, went bankrupt in January 1981, destroyed by a strong pound that jumped from $1.56 to $2.35 and annihilated its export markets. The government-backed rescue of Triang Pedigree in 1975, jointly funded by Whitehall and Airfix Industries, ended in receivership by 1977 and factory closure in Merthyr Tydfil by 1978. Kenneth Brown identified the period 1979 to 1984 as the collapse of the British toy industry. By 1972, Hong Kong had replaced Japan as the world's largest toy exporter, with over 2,000 factories and 56,000 workers by 1980. The competitive advantages that had sustained British manufacturers, craft skills, tool-making expertise, design heritage, could not overcome the cost differential. And the cultural shift was equally devastating. Television, electronic games, and eventually the digital revolution drew children away from the patient, mechanical pleasures of model building. The loud, dangerous, oil-spitting world of control line diesel flying was replaced by something quieter, cleaner, and infinitely less demanding. The buzzing stopped. Chapter 10. The moulds that survived everything. The moulds had one more journey to make. After the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, Frog's tooling remained scattered across now independent countries. Factories that had once been coordinated from Moscow were suddenly operating, or not operating, under new flags, new economies, new uncertainties. The Donetsk toy factory went bankrupt in 2003, but continued producing intermittently. The Minsk factory ceased in 1996. Tashkent had stopped in 1991, the year the USSR dissolved. Then, in 2014, the Donetsk factory was shelled during the war in eastern Ukraine. There were casualties, moulds that had begun their journey in a South London toy factory that had been designed by men like Cyril Steen and Ron Ahrens, and cut by 200 expert toolmakers in a works that made its own packing cases and grew its own trees. Those moulds were now in a war zone. They had survived the bankruptcy of Lines Brothers. They had survived the bankruptcy of DCM. They had survived the collapse of the Soviet Union. They had not been designed to survive artillery. Most of the surviving ex-Frog moulds were eventually rescued by ARC Models in Moscow, which since 2018 has been producing a historical series in boxes with Novo-style design, classic instructions, decals, and colour schemes. Frog tooling, now approaching its 7th decade, is still cutting plastic. The craftsmanship of those Merton toolmakers, the steel mould blocks cut on pantograph machines from patterns carved in yellow pine, has outlived the company, the parent, the rescuer, the Soviet Union, and the Cold War itself. The Triang Works site on Morden Road has undergone 3 transformations since Lines Brothers' collapse. After lying dormant from 1971 to 1973, it was occupied by Sleep Easy Limited, the mattress manufacturer, who renumbered the address to 61 Morden Road. Sleep Easy remained until 2008 when the site was cleared. Today the southern portion houses a big yellow self-storage facility. The broader area has become the Merton Industrial Park, accessed via Jubilee Way off the A24, light industrial and warehouse units. A home-base retail store occupies part of the footprint. The factory's half-mile of railway sidings has been replaced by Morantum Way, now a road for cars rather than freight wagons. No physical trace remains of the factory that was once the largest toy works on Earth. No plaque marks where 4,000 people made fairy cycles, frog diesels, and pedigree dolls. No memorial records where Neville Shute Norway directed rocket glider development, where toolmakers cut the moulds for the world's first plastic model kits, or where a man on the packing line once handed a free E-Type Jaguar to a child peering through the window. Today, Hornby Hobbies, listed on the London Stock Exchange, owns Hornby Railways, Airfix, Humbrol Paints, Corgi Toys, and Scalextric. The survivors of 3 collapsed empires. Lines Brothers, Meccano, and Airfix Industries gathered under one roof. Heritage brands, marketed with a conscious appeal to nostalgia. The manufacturing has long since moved to China. The collector community keeps the memory closer to the ground. At any given time, roughly 1,000 Frog items are listed on eBay UK. Common unbuilt kits sell for £5 to £25. Rare subjects: the scimitar, the javelin, the DH-110 prototypes. Command significantly more and simply don't appear. The pre-war cellulose acetate. Penguins are specialists' treasures, unstable in their own material, survivors against the chemistry of time. Dedicated websites maintain the archive. frogmodelaircraft.co.uk in Poland. houseoffrog.co.uk. Preserving Eric Walpole's first-person testimony. Adrian Duncan's extraordinarily detailed engine reviews at adriansmodelaeroengines.com. The definitive reference remains Frog Model Aircraft 1932 to 1976 by Richard Lines, Arthur Lines' own son, and Leif Hellstrom. A corporate history and, implicitly, a family elegy. And the collector community has an affectionate name for the Soviet-produced kits that came back across the Iron Curtain in those distinctive blue boxes. They call them Frog Spawn. Chapter 11. The Silence in the Wrong Shape. Eric Walpole joined the experimental department at Merton in 1953. He designed Spitfires and Wyverns and Mustangs from yellow pine patterns. He tested control line models in local playing fields and drove home from weekend shows after a dinner and a bottle of wine paid for by the company. When the experimental department closed, he was moved to pedigree dolls. He was offered a transfer to Canterbury. He declined. He left for what he described only as other places. He died in September 2012. The factory where he'd spent his best working years had been a mattress warehouse for most of his adult life. The moulds he may have helped develop were being run in Moscow. The smell of ether and castor oil had faded from London's parks decades before. George Fletcher, whose masterwork was the Frog 349, drove the colourful Frog van to shows and competitions on weekends that nobody paid him overtime for. Gordon Cornell, who refined the 150R under Fletcher's guidance, went on to become chief designer at E.D. Burt Judge, who designed rocket gliders for Neville Shute and ran engine production in the post-war years, had already moved on before the Golden Age reached its peak. Ron Aarons, the former rear gunner, who designed the Tempest kit. Cyril Steen, who crossed from Airfix. Bill Knox, the Undertaker's son who designed the Chipmunk. Each name a thread pulled from a tapestry that no one thought to preserve while the loom was still running. The Frog 349 diesel. Cross-flow loop scavenging, drum valve induction, the best crankcase casting Peter Chin had ever seen on a British engine. Still runs. Collectors who maintain them say the engines appear to run forever if properly used. 70 years on. Still turning over. Still producing that unmistakable sound, that unmistakable smell. The castor oil and ether drifting across whatever garden or field the owner has found, carrying with it the ghost of every Saturday morning, in every park in Britain where a boy with oily fingers and a stinging knuckle learned what internal combustion actually meant. The company that built the 349 was destroyed not by its own failings, but by the failings of those who owned it. Lines Brothers' acquisition binge, its second generation's inability to manage what the first generation had created, the cascading collapse that dragged Frog down alongside Triang Railways, and Pedigree Dolls, and Scalextric, and Hornby, and Meccano, and Dinky Toys. All of it was external to Frog. The engines were good, the kits were good, the toolmakers were among the best in London. The design department was staffed by people who cared about the work. None of that was enough, because none of it existed independently of the corporate structure that owned it. When the Wilmots and Mansour separated their patents into a different company in 1931, they understood something about the fragility of depending on others. When IMA was merged into Rovex in 1965, that protection was stripped away. The 47-acre site on Morden Road is quiet now. Self-storage units where the injection moulding presses once stood. A road where the railway sidings ran. No plaque, no trace, just the silence. And it's a particular kind of silence, the kind that settles over a place that was built for noise and movement and the rhythmic clatter of 4,000 people making things, and now holds nothing but other people's surplus furniture and forgotten possessions locked behind rolling shutters. Not through one catastrophe, not through a single boardroom betrayal, through a long chain of reasonable-sounding decisions, an acquisition here, a merger there, an overseas expansion that looked bold on the presentation slides. Each one moving the work a little further from the hands that knew how to do it, until the moulds were crated and shipped to the Soviet Union, and the buzzing in the parks fell silent, and the smell of ether and castor oil became nothing more than a memory that could stop a grown man in his tracks if he caught a trace of it on the wind.